today on the Bold Move podcast, we are sitting down with attorney Ken Good, who is out of Texas, and you specialize in a lot of bail reform issues. And really, truly, and we'll get into it, but you're fighting the good fight to make sure that there's some accountability with people's behavior within the justice system. So thank you for joining me here today. I appreciate it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, and I hope your Thanksgiving was good.
It was awesome. Yeah, it was a good time. Very low key, which is nice.
My favorite kind.
Exactly. So the issue of bail reform, I think it is regionally kind of blowing up in some areas, but under the surface, it's kind of about to boil over, I think, because there's a lot of different activist groups out there that are really advocating to eliminate the entire bail process, bail system. And that, and I think some of them are good intention. I think some of them are, have some other issues, underlying issues, put your tinfoil hat stuff on, but I think that's there too. But really on the other side of the argument, really we have to keep our community safe. And that's really what it boils down to. And so we'll get into a lot of this stuff. And really what I'm hoping to do is, Ken, if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit about yourself, how the bail reform, I guess, subject landed in your lap and why it's so important.
Well, I don't know if I've ever said this before. So let me start with, my grandfather was a sharecropper. So, I grew up very blue collar. And so didn't have any problem working hard. And I always thought, if you work hard, you're going to get the benefit from that. And so I had two parents who were public school teachers. And the worst thing about them is they were coaches. And so my siblings and I were the most competitive people you ever saw. Wow. But we also were taught the importance of an education. So my mom and I used to watch Perry Mason late at night. And so I always dreamed of going to law school. And so I went to law school and, I didn't get in the first time. I graduated from college in 3 years. I worked full time. So my grades suffered. And so I got a master's degree, taught high school, and then reapplied and got into law school, did really well, was, top in my class. I was law review. I was on a bunch of national teams, and the national teams that kind of got me interested in appellate issues, making legal arguments about issues. And so that comes back on the bail reform front and center. So I entered, I went to private practice after I graduated from law school. The dean of my law school asked me to consider clerking at the Texas Supreme Court. He said he could get me a job there, and I already had a job waiting for me, and I was poor, and the job at the Texas Supreme Court paid less than the job that I had waiting for me. And I said, thank you very much, but I have a lot of student loans to pay back. And so I'm going to go into private practice. And so I was offered a job by a law firm in Dallas for either its Dallas office or its Tyler office. And, me being a small town boy, I went to the smaller of the two towns, and I started practicing law with a guy who I thought was probably one of the best defense attorneys in the state. He taught me how to practice law. We represent doctors and hospitals, but because of my background in arguing appellate issues, I was doing our appellate cases really early. And so, in Texas, you have to be an attorney for 5 years, and you have to have all these other requirements before you can be board certified in appellate issues. I met all the requirements other than the 5 years, like at year 4. And so I really did. I argued my first case at the Texas Supreme Court before I was a 5-year lawyer. And some attorneys don't have that for their whole life, their whole career. I argued 2 cases at the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, which regulates bail. So I've been very, very fortunate. And so we were representing doctors and hospitals, and so a bondsman had a whole bunch of issues, and he asked somebody, what kind of attorney do you hire for this? And they said, you need an appellate attorney, and you should hire this guy I know, and it was me. And so that's kind of what got me started into this area of the law. Word of mouth spread, you do good work, people want you to work for them. And so I was in Houston and someone had asked me to attend a hearing in a federal case. It was called Houston or Harris County versus, or O'Donnell versus Harris County. And it was one of the early hearings in the case that became a seminal case. It was important. It was cited across the country.
Wow.
And when I was there, I just thought the judge was wrong. I thought she was applying the legal issues incorrectly to the case, and she was entrenched. I've argued over the years that she drank the Kool-Aid that the plaintiffs were selling, and she was convinced they were right and that everybody else was wrong. And her rulings reflected that. And so I came out of the hearing calling my friends, calling, clients and saying, we need to become experts on these issues because nobody else is going to tell our version of the story. And the version that we're hearing in court is nothing close to reality. And so I set out to become just that, knowledgeable on these legal issues, an expert on them, and I follow the cases. And even though the O'Donnell case was cited across the country, ultimately it was reversed and reversed multiple times. And I think I was proven correct on my concerns about her because she's been reversed 6, 7, 8 times on those issues. And ultimately the court said that case should have never been filed in federal court.
Wow.
And so I've written numerous articles about it. I've written articles on other cases, and then kind of we branched out on other issues. We become knowledgeable about one. We become knowledgeable about crime. We look, why is the FBI crime statistics saying that crime is going down when that just doesn't seem to match with what we're seeing on the ground? And I've even done a debate with the law firm that was filing all those cases nationwide. And, their arguments mirror what the national party is saying. It's almost like the national party has outsourced their arguments on immigration and crime to this group. I mean, and it was really troubling because I knew I was so prepared. I thought I was so prepared. I was going to do such a good job. I'm such a great attorney, blah, 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 blah. And I lost my temper because, when they don't have an argument to respond to you, when they just start calling you racist. And, being from a small town and, you just don't call me racist. I don't mind getting in the mud, but come on, don't call me racist. I'll have a legal argument with you all day and I'll tell you where you're wrong. But, when you just say you're racist, that's meant to cut off your debate because you're not worthy to be even listened to.
Right.
And so that really got under my skin. And after they did that for about 20 minutes straight, I was like, come on, give me a break. And so I was really embarrassed later that I did that. And I wished I hadn't. But because it would have been a better debate without that,
Sure.
Because I was doing so well up until then. But I've continued to write articles about it, and I really think that I've written articles specifically about the crime issue, kind of responding to their issues, and it seems like a lot of things. I mean, I don't want to knock on wood, but a lot of the things that I've been arguing have all turned out to be correct. And the really cool thing is these people filing these cases make the same arguments in every case, even when they lose. And they never tell the next court, hey, we lost this case. We lost the same argument. We've lost the same argument 5 times. And as attorneys, we have an ethical duty to do that. And they never have. I mean, they were quoted in an article after losing the very last case and saying, well, we've never had a trial court that hasn't agreed with us that bail's unconstitutional. And they didn't say the next part. And every court of appeals that has reviewed it has reversed. I mean, I ended up writing a letter to the editor and it was published. And I quoted all of the cases that they keep getting reversed in. So it's kind of scary where you have to respond to the same arguments. And they're used to counties and cities not willing to spend the money. And now I think they're realizing we have to spend the money because we have no choice because what they're wanting us to do is going to make the problem much, much worse.
Yeah, it's something that's not going away. And I think, for the audience members that don't know the process, just to kind of have a blanket overview, when somebody gets arrested, most of the time, whether it's a felony that's not super egregious, like your murders or your rapes or those types of things, or if it's a misdemeanor type crime, you're given some type of bail that's either inherent in the jurisdiction that you're in, or in some areas, the officer that placed you on arrest will actually set the bail initially. But the reason why that's the case is because we don't just want somebody who just committed a crime to get out and do it over again. And I can't tell you how many times as a corrections officer I've released people just to go back out and, you know, either violate a no contact order from a domestic
Mhm.
violence situation, or who's still a little bit drunk and got back into their car and tried to drive away, you know, all these different things. And those are on some of the less egregious side, but it happens. It's human
Oh,
nature.
during COVID, we were keeping track. I mean, we were going, what's the record this month? Because people would get out because of COVID. They were getting simple release, and they would get out and commit another crime within hours.
Sure.
And then, I mean, the record was like 5 or 6 times you got arrested within one day.
Wow. Wow. That's that. And it doesn't, I would love to say that it surprised me, but it doesn't, because um, when COVID happened, culturally, obviously there's a huge impact, but when it comes to the criminal culture, a lot of their resources were going away. And when people get desperate, that reflects in their behavior, right? And a lot of that is, hey, look, I can't make rent because I lost my job because they shut my company down. So I'm going to make money this way, right?
Well,
And
also during COVID, you did a lot of these proposed bail reform measures that have been in theory discussed as possibilities. They were all put in action, even though there's no science that ever supported them. And
right,
so we got to see bail reform on steroids during COVID, and these same people that you're talking about saw that as a green light to commit more crime.
for sure, absolutely. They thought they had community support behind it, right? Which
Yeah, well,
doesn't
they
make
couldn't be
sense.
held. I mean, as long as it was a certain crime on a certain list, then they would not be taken to jail because it was too dangerous. And so, as long as they stayed on that list, they would just get released and released, and they weren't trying cases. So, our criminal elements would see that as a green light to commit more crime.
Yeah, absolutely. And really, the way bail is, in my eyes, is supposed to be used is that checks and balances, right? Hey,
Hmm.
you need to have a vested interest if you're going to be released to not violate these conditions, and part of that is you're not getting your money back. I mean, that's that.
I think the worst failure of these bail reform movements, especially in our urban cities, is they kind of do a charge based release system where it's if you're charged with this, you automatically get released, and they make a long list of these are the charges. And the problem with that is so contrary to our concept of bail because we want to do whatever is individualized and is needed to get you to change your ways. So we don't look at criminal history. We don't look at dangerousness like in New York. And so, because, you and me, first time offenders, we should be treated the same. But if
Sure.
I'm a 10-time offender and you're a 5-time offender, well, then obviously this cut and release is not working. And so you need more pressure. And I need more pressure than that. But these bail reform movements have taken all that out and moved to a cookie cutter charge based release system. And that's not working.
Right, right. Is there, and just to kind of recap, a lot of the messaging from the bail reform side of the house is they want to abolish it altogether, right?
Yeah,
They're
they
not
want to
even,
argue, hey, look, we don't need bail. Little Johnny wants to come back and he wants to resolve his criminal case. And so we don't need them putting up security. We don't need them paying a bondsman a premium so that they can ensure that they're going to come back. And I think that was conclusively blown out of the water during COVID because we found out people don't want to come back. I mean, there was a study from Yolo County, New York, California, where the DA said compared people released on simple release versus people released on a private surety bond, and found that people low level nonviolent offenses charge the person who just was simply released had a over 200% greater chance of committing a new violent offense in the next 18 months, just
real.
over the type of release mechanism used.
Wow. And it's just because, I don't know, I'm sure there's a lot of research done on this, but it's really because there isn't that accountability piece.
There's
there's
not accountability, but also when you're going to a bondsman, it's usually your family that's going to the bondsman. And so, I mean, I'm telling you, if you have a brother and he's standing up for you and you've been arrested 5 times before, but he says, look, I think you still have value. I'm willing to stand up for you. I'm willing to put up money for you. I'm willing to take a risk for you. And I'm doing this because I love you and I think you still have value and can be turned around. Well, that has a huge impact. And we're taking that opportunity, that chance away. And we're just saying, oh, everybody wants to come back, or we don't care if they come back or not for certain offenses. Really,
Yeah.
if you go to California, misdemeanors are being simply released. They're not being given a private surety bond. So they have an 80% failure to appear rate. All those cases are getting put on hold. And if you don't come back under their Speedy Trial Act within a certain amount of time, their cases are dismissed. So,
And they're
I mean,
probably
you can
still
see,
overrun. They're not even, they
yeah, the
can't be
career
on top of
criminals are just having a field day. They know exactly how to play the system.
it. Yeah.
And nobody cares currently, it seems.
Yeah, it was interesting because you bring up California, and I would imagine that is really an epicenter of a lot of these reform acts because,
Well, it has, but it has not, because, the Texas legislature, the California legislature passed major bail reform, and they had a petition drive to put it on the ballot to allow the voters to veto it. And that's what happened. It was vetoed. Then we had COVID come up, and so they did the zero bail policies. Well, then when COVID was over, they took them back. But then now LA County has redone them because even though the voters vetoed what the legislature did, they decided they wanted to do it in LA County anyway. And look what happened. The LA County DA was just defeated by over 20-something points.
Right, right. Well, and it's so funny because I think it was last year. No, it's earlier this year. We went to an agency in California to provide a training that we do. It's our transport and court operations school. And when we flew in there, and it was in Oakland area, and when we flew in there, the rental car guy was like, "Hey, man, whatever you do, don't get gas around the airport." And I'm like,
wow,
it's kind of weird. Are you trying to trick me into buying the prepaid gas thing? Right. And he was like, no, they'll kill you for your luggage. They don't care. There's nothing holding them accountable here. All the businesses in the area had shut down. I think like the first In-N-Out Burger was in that area. They shut that down. There's just no recourse. And now, not only do you have proven criminals that have been charged with stuff and convicted with stuff out mulling around, now they're emboldened because they don't believe that there's any repercussions for their behavior.
Well, I think that when like in Oakland, there's the city within the city. You've got this group of people that are really committing a large number of the crimes. But between the two groups, there's this whole nother segment that's in the gray area. And every day they're looking between the two groups to say, hey, am I going to follow the law? And, when they set up policies that say we're not going to prosecute theft under $950, well, that sends a clear message to the gray area people. Well, hey, I'm going to join the city of crime right now because there's no accountability. And that's what we've seen. And that's why, we had Proposition 32 in California to roll back this, theft under $950 is not going to be prosecuted anymore. So that passed overwhelmingly with millions and millions of dollars being spent to oppose it. It still passed because people have had enough on crime. When the people on the left who are saying, oh, you're still safe, even though we're not prosecuting crime under $950, but just don't believe your lying eyes because businesses are closing because they can't withstand $25,000 a day in shoplifting. Businesses are closing because they can't provide a safe environment for their employees. And then the property values drop like a frickin' stone. I mean, you've got commercial property selling for 30 to 50% of what they were worth the last time they sold 3 or 4 years ago in San Francisco. Minneapolis, you've got 2 properties that just sold for 9% of what they sold for the last time they're sold. You're now seeing taxes just go down in what they're collecting because of commercial property values. I mean, the default rate on commercial properties has gone from 5% to 45% because of these policies. And it's just crazy. And you've got the the crazy left now saying, oh, no, that's not the real reason why it's happening. It's some other reason. No. Your only argument for crime was not going up was the FBI statistics, and shock of all shocks, a month before the election, they were just mysteriously changed to show crime is going up. And, there's a reason for that.
Yeah. Weird how that works out.
Yeah.
So you kind of go into a different area here, and that is crime reporting, right? Because we talked about COVID and how, I think a lot of those statistics during that time are false simply because of the accounting measures were they're gone, right? Everybody was trying to figure out which way was up and all that.
Yeah.
And because it systematically changed the way law enforcement and the justice system does business in a lot of different avenues. I think that we are now starting to see a lot of the repercussions from that happening.
Well, one of the things that I think a lot of people have had difficulty with is they're just like, what is the rationale for the left doing all this crazy stuff? And I agree with what you've said earlier. It's a coalition. Some of that coalition is true believers, but some of them have an agenda. But it takes the whole coalition. That's one of the reasons why they lost. They lost some of their coalition, the people that are like, no, I want to feel safe. But so I've kind of spent a lot of time looking at what's been driving this push, the people who have an agenda, what's driving that. And I think this is just my opinion, but my opinion is the largest budget item in these counties is law enforcement.
Mm-hmm.
And so if they can reduce the law enforcement budget, that money can then be moved to what they really want to spend it on, and those are social issues. And so this defund the police, or we don't have to have bail, people will return to court, are all arguments for reducing law enforcement's budget. And then that money was moved over to social issues. And as we've had to come back and spend the money on law enforcement to reinvest, we haven't deducted it where we put it. And so it's just had an impact of increasing. I think they're, in my opinion, they thought we're going to start in Democrat strongholds. It's going to work so well that we can then move out to Republican areas or the middle. And that just shows that they swallow the Kool-Aid themselves, because normally if I try something and it doesn't work, my wife will say, you dumbass, that didn't work. Let's do something else. But these people were so entrenched, they couldn't give up. We just need more time. We just look in New York, the architect of the bail reform there is like, we're not changing one more item. We're not changing one more item. Well, it's because it was political. It wasn't real, and it hasn't been real.
Yeah. Well, and I taking politics out of it, if you look at, budgets, you're exactly right. You say law enforcement, but any county, any city, the biggest contributing budgetary item is a jail, right? And the reason for that is medical costs, right? The people that come into jails aren't the epitome of health, right? They're dealing with all kinds of drug issues, pre-existing medical issues that haven't been touched before, right? You name it, they got it. And I think there's probably some math being done that's saying, hey, look, the less people in jail, the less liability the jail holds, the less food items we have to put it into play there, the less commissary, the less officers we have to use to manage the inmate population, and so I think that there is some stuff going on there behind the scenes that maybe even.
Yeah, but look at the way they started their argument. They started their argument saying, oh, there's all these first-time offenders stuck in jail, and we just can't have that as a society because of the private surety bail system. And that's not true. I mean, as an insider, first-time offenders haven't been in jail for 20 years. I mean, they're not. If they're stuck in jail, it's because of some administrative snafu. It's not because of anything else. And so that's just not true. You can see that, the charitable bail funds found that out. They got in trouble because they found out there wasn't anybody just stuck in jail. And so the people that they started bonding out were the people who were career criminals that no one else would bond out. That's
Oh
why they
no.
got in trouble. And so I think you see a lot of myths, the attacks that were originally made were not true. I mean, I agree the bail industry is an easy target. I mean, people always want to move to something else, and we would if we could. The problem is the bail industry does one thing, it does it very good, and it gets people to go to court, and there's not anything else that compares. And so that's the problem. If you want people to go to court, you need the private industry bail system. If you go to these simple release mechanisms with a 50 to 80% failure to appear rate, that causes huge backlogs and mucks up your courts. It causes you to push for de facto decriminalization, which is dismissals. And that's a green light for people to commit more crime. And that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. All you got to do is not care about what that looks like on your record,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
your average
And
criminal.
what the left really missed out on is if they had incorporated a very strong accountability element to their proposals, it would have worked. It would have worked a lot more successfully. We wouldn't be having this discussion. But the problem is there would be a lot more people in jail as a result of it.
Sure.
They had to have the jail population reduced. They wanted the budgets to be reduced. And the problem is they forgot about public safety. The public, citizens demand public safety. If you don't give it to us, then we will get it for ourselves. That's the reason why there's a guy in trial in New York for helping out someone who was having trouble with somebody, and then they ended up dying.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're hitting California, so I'll talk about it. But there's plenty of cases where store owners are getting charged or cited and even arrested themselves for protecting their own merchandise or for protecting themselves or customers. And there's no positive repercussion for that. It's hey, you come in and steal my stuff, or you threaten me with a gun and I try to fight back and I'm going to jail. That's absolutely asinine, but that's where it is a lot of ways. I think there's a lot of messaging just, for wanting people to just back off and not be confrontational.
Well, but let's talk about that's a really important issue, because when that came up in California, the opposition to it said, hey, this is exactly what this does. And the party apparatus just said, that's a lie. That's not what this does. I mean, it's like when they passed Proposition 47, which decriminalized crime under $950, or that was the ultimate impact of it. They called it the Safe Streets Act or something like that. It's going to make us safer. And so they end up arguing that a bill will do the opposite of what it's going to do if you just look at it. And so, I mean, you've seen that in a whole bunch of other ways. And even, in the last couple of days with the president pardoning his son, you just lose credibility. You get caught lying so many times. And, when I was a young attorney, I always taught people in a case, once you're proven to be a liar, you're a liar the rest of the time in the case. So you take that to politics. And once you're proven to be a liar, you're a liar the rest of your political life, not just a lawsuit.
Yeah.
And so I think that will be hard and difficult to overcome. And I think, our president, whose term is ending in just a couple of months, will be tarnished for probably the rest of his political career and maybe the rest of his life, because he made promises about, I will not pardon my son. And he made them strong and hard. And he said that for many, for a couple of years. And then suddenly now he's pardoning and he's saying the DOJ is politicized. Well, I'm like, isn't that the whole argument that the other party's been making about the DOJ for a couple of years?
Yeah, we're going to ignore that though. Yeah, that's trouble because, nobody likes politicians, but I think in law enforcement, we know that it's obviously not okay to lie, but we have a mechanism of that, right? If you get caught lying under oath, you get on a Brady list and you de facto become a desk pusher at that point. You don't get to be a part of big cases because as soon as they put you on the stand, you're done.
Oh, that's a very good point. That's a great point, because you can ruin yourself as law enforcement. You can ruin yourself where you can never be involved in anything that will require you to be on the stand. I mean, that's a great point. And, we have situations where somebody gets caught in such a large screw up for law enforcement, they have to go back and review all their past cases to see if it infected any of those. So, I mean, I think that's a good point. And, to your point about nobody likes politicians, I think, we all like our politicians. But I will say this, at the local level, law enforcement has the most credibility with their local politicians. I mean, I've had stuff at the state legislature in Texas, and for a long before people knew who I was, and I'm not saying they do now, but before I became, a person that's a resource, I would go and I would work for a month to convince this committee that I was correct on something and that they were going to go with me. And then frickin' one day before the hearing, they would get 30 phone calls from law enforcement. And then all of a sudden, well, Ken, we're just going to, this is what law enforcement wants. And so we're going to have to go with them. And so I learned I need to convince law enforcement before I go to the stupid committee, because I'm just Ken. When y'all start calling in big numbers, screw me, they're going to go with y'all every time.
Yeah. And I don't know why there's a level of credibility there, but I think it is. And it's almost like with the politicians, there should be some type of mechanism that has some accountability towards being honest, other than it's the right thing to do, because that hasn't panned out so great in our history.
Where does it break down though? Because, I remember in Harris County, they, this settlement that they did in the O'Donnell case, which they're still following, even though the case has been reversed, you've got situations where the DA is issuing a report. I mean, the district attorney, the top officer of law enforcement, issuing a report saying it's not working. And then they just discount it because she's law enforcement. Now, I mean, really? I mean, that should be the most credible source.
Yeah.
And so I've done some podcasts talking about why she attacked their report and the numbers. And then you can go to New York, and they were cooking their books in the exact same way. And it was on recidivism rates. And so it was very interesting to see how different groups are using the same numbers to cook the books, and they're using the same arguments against law enforcement, saying, well, you can't believe them. They're law enforcement.
Right.
Well, law enforcement's the best source for that information.
Absolutely. I mean, we feed the FBI. All the uniform crime statistic stuff that comes from your local law enforcement. They're not doing it themselves. We have to provide that. So,
well, one of the things that I went, and compared to the FBI statistic was the CDC numbers on homicide, because CDC tracks homicides, and that's a different federal agency tracking something that the FBI tracks, but their numbers were drastically different. And so, I mean, CDC's numbers were 20% higher than the FBI's numbers. And so that's one argument I was using, that I'm not saying that I wasn't saying that the FBI statistics were wrong. I wrote an article about it, but I was saying that here's evidence to call in question that there's something off between these two numbers. And I mean, I had that article published in October in the Attorney at Law magazine. 9 days later, suddenly the FBI statistics changed and showed crime was higher than what they were reporting. I mean, it wasn't because of my article, but my timing was great. I mean, the Attorney at Law article, Attorney at Law magazine put a little postscript to my article, and I just thought, wow, what timing. I mean, I was clean living is the reason for that, nothing else.
Very fortuitous. But yeah, it's interesting when you use statistics like that to prove an argument, and then you look at the same statistics aren't accurate. Like, somebody has to be wrong, right? They can't.
Yeah.
So it's almost like, let's throw that out. And the only thing that we can look at for, I don't know, bolstering an argument is what happens in real life, what we're seeing on the streets, what we're, and we can see the proofs in the pudding that crime isn't down. Crime is awful.
No,
right?
Crime is awful. And the biggest thing we don't even talk about is the rising number of unreported crimes, because people have lost faith with law enforcement, and their closing rate on those big cases is dropping for a bunch of reasons. But because of that, people are losing faith and quit reporting cases. And so it's a lot higher than what we're seeing.
Here in Washington, right after George Floyd, there was a lot of police reform, and you probably saw it in the news in Seattle. They actually took over a precinct and a whole city block, which is ridiculous. But it was so demoralizing for the law enforcement officers. it's like, why even show up to work? But one of the things that happened there legislatively was really limited the type of call that our officers could respond to. And what ended up happening with that, and that has since been fixed, I would say.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you this, and this is just my opinion, though legislatively it's been fixed, morale wise in our officers, it
Yeah.
hasn't been fixed there. And you'll get a call, and I'm not saying they're not showing up, but I'll tell you, they're not coming with any heat. They're not coming with any.
Well, I mean, when you've got, okay, we're going to send a caseworker or a social worker on certain calls, it just suddenly you've made the job of triage crucially important, because, I mean, what's going to happen when you send the caseworker? I mean, it's like sending somebody with a knife to a gunfight.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm sure that there were, I mean, the reason why it was fixed is because they had examples of that. I mean, It didn't, I mean, what's the legal exposure in those situations where you send a social worker to somebody that's got a shootout going on?
Well, and you're exactly right. It's, I don't know that there was one particular case that was highlighted in the news, because a lot of that stuff kind of.
No, they're not going to highlight any of that because it's contrary to the narrative.
Yeah,
I mean, look at what they did in Seattle and Oregon with all the drugs, and just looking the other way. And so suddenly we have, the equivalent of open opium dens, and you're setting new records every month on overdoses. And I mean, thank God in Oregon they allowed that decriminalization of all the heavy drug statutes to lapse and not be renewed, because that little social experiment and the one in Seattle that was similar was a complete and abject failure.
Yeah. And it has been, and it is everywhere. Heroin is everywhere.
And I would say, what would I mean, this sounds really bad, and I intend for it to sound really bad, but what would our elected officials have done differently if they had been in the pocket of cartels, drug dealers? What would they have done differently than what they did?
That's a really good question. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you can't, we de facto decriminalized having any heavy drug, right? The only thing that people are cranky about is fentanyl, because that's a hot button word, but they're still letting it go all over the place.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Here at our local grocery store, there was a story, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, that there was a bag of fentanyl found in the kids' toy aisle, right? I mean, it's all over the place. You're swimming in it.
I mean, I was always taught, worry about the small stuff. The big stuff will take care of themselves. We're now in this era of, we shouldn't worry about the small stuff. We should only worry about the big stuff. Well, the problem is, it creates many problems. Today's small stuff is the training ground for tomorrow's big stuff. That's the reason why our jails are full of very dangerous people, because we've given up on the small stuff. And so we have opportunities to turn people, but they're not there anymore. And so they're just pushing on to the big stuff. And I think that that's a huge mistake, and we need to correct that. But a lot of the push, like in California, is because they're just not willing to build more prisons. Their prisons are full. They put the federal courts put a cap on how many people can be in them, and so they had to release a bunch of people. And the Supreme Court said this will cause crime to go up, but the local politicians said, "Oh, we'll be safer." Gosh, I wonder which group was right. It was the Supreme Court. In their dissent, said this is what's happened every time you release the equivalent of a division of criminals into society. They commit more crime. Shock. That's what happened.
Yeah. And that type of, I wish I had an answer, because it seems like we've gotten so far deep down this social experiment, like you called it, that it's tough to turn the ship back, right? I mean, if we start,
we have something that shows us what we need to do. There's a case called Sanchez versus Alabama. That's a case that was similar to the O'Donnell case, where they had to live under a preliminary injunction. They had to live under it for 4 years, where they couldn't hold anybody. They just had to do simple release for everybody. And this little bitty county said, no, this isn't right. We're going to go up. We're not going to give in. We're not going to settle. We're not going to do anything. We're just going to take it to the courts. 4 years later, it was reversed.
Wow.
And I talked to the sheriff on a podcast that I have. And so he said, look, it took us a while, but we re-implemented a system of accountability. We over time let people know that if they didn't show up for court, there were consequences. And over about 6 months, crime started to go down. So we know, I mean, we know how to fight crime. The problem is, will the politicians allow us to? And I'm very hopeful, because the public will eventually demand it if the politicians don't, and the politicians will be gone. I mean, the best example I can give you is in Houston, Texas, Harris County, that every sitting judge that had an opponent was defeated. We just didn't have enough opponents running against them.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, and you look what happened at the election here, the tough on crime side, or the tough on crime party, overwhelmingly took over the country. Because I think you're right. People, even the center left type person, seeing the results of that type of mentality, and they're done with it. Right? They're done with it.
They are. And you know what? We've been through this cycle before. In the 60s, we felt safe. We were more forgiving on our criminal laws. Crime started going up. And we had a debate between our two parties on what to do. We had one party that refused to participate in addressing crime increasing. And so it festered. And then we had a backlash, and we ended up with Reagan and the war on drugs. So we're really I was arguing 2 years ago that we are having a backlash. And 2 years ago, we didn't, because the issue of abortion overcame the crime issue. 2 years later, abortion did not overcome the crime immigration issue. And that's the reason why we had the result we had.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of interesting. I don't know if you listen to Andy Frisella's podcast, but he talks a lot about what's truly important in a society, right? And you're right, the abortion issue did navigate a lot of people's votes. But if you look at it, you know, regardless of where you land on it, it's something that may not affect you in your entire life. And if it does, it'll probably affect you once in your entire life. And then you look at crime.
Yeah.
Like, that's an everyday thing that we have to. Public safety is critical for businesses to operate, for you to get food on your table, for you to go to work, like all these things. So what's important, and I'm really glad that this past month, a lot of those decisions were made using a lot of common sense. So
well, and I was arguing for the last year, we can go back to identity politics after this election. But for this one election, vote crime, because if you vote crime, then the Democrat Party, which has historically been a tough on crime, a law and order, public safety party, just like the Republican Party, it will come back to its roots. And then in the next election, when we're all anti-crime, we can then become identity politics again. But I think it's going to be difficult to go back to identity politics. There's been a couple of articles saying identity politics is dead. I don't know if I'd go that far.
Really interesting, because that point that you made, crime really is, and it's not even crime, it's public safety. It's the ability for the average person to feel safe doing whatever they have to do to survive, right? And if you don't have that safety aspect, everything else kind of crumbles down. So when
I was in college, I never thought twice about going at 2 a.m. to check my balance in the ATM machine. But a girl at that time was taught you don't go out at dark by yourself. Well, now, I mean, I'm old, so 40 years later, now it's both sexes. You really don't, you have to be careful. You have to go out with groups at night. And girls, I would say they just don't go out at night because it's just not safe, especially in our urban areas, in our inner cities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I believe in the Second Amendment. I carry just about everywhere I go. I still don't want to get into a situation where I'd have to exercise that, right? You know what I mean? So I think there is a lot of that. Now, I'm lucky enough. I live in kind of a rural area outside of Seattle. I can see Seattle from where my house is. I don't want to go over there. But we don't have a lot of those issues, but they're close, and you talk to people around where I'm at, and they're saying, I'm not going to Seattle. I don't want to go. I detest.
Well, that's one of the arguments that I make is, if so the government's making it hard not making it hard. They're reducing the police force so that they can't protect me. Yeah. But at the same time, they won't allow me the tools to protect myself.
Yeah.
I mean, if you are going to say, oh, we're going to cut our budget and we're going to move that money over to social programs, well, okay, at the very least, give me the tools to protect myself. I mean, thank God I live in Texas where, if I shot somebody coming into my house, I agree with you. I sure wouldn't want to have to pull the trigger. But if I did, if they're breaking into my house, I'm probably not even getting submitted to the grand jury. And if I
Right.
am, the likelihood of a no bill is very high.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, we talk a lot about that side of things when it comes to firearms, but it used to be, our advice would be, hey, look, have an attorney ready to go if you ever get into a self-defense type shooting. Um, you know, answer pertinent questions to law enforcement, that type of thing. But now, hey, don't say a freaking word
Yeah.
because we don't know what officer is going to be there. Not saying that the officer is going to be anti self-defense, but a lot of times they're like, yeah, this is too much of a politicized issue. I'm going to just do
Well,
whatever.
I'm not advocating for this, but a lot of people don't have either the resources or the environment for it. But we have two dogs.
Mm,
And one of them is a white German Shepherd. Sounds like the most ferocious thing you've ever seen. So if somebody was trying to break into my house, the dogs would be going apeshit crazy.
sure.
And, that noise by itself, I think would scare most people away. And so I like that. I mean, that's the best option. If you can scare them away, instead of having to pull a trigger on something. I don't want to hurt somebody. I mean, I was raised in the church, you don't want, to do anything like that. But I'm also an Old Testament Baptist where I believe in an eye for an eye. And if you're coming for me or my family, then you're going to have a little problem.
Yeah.
You could beat me up really easily, but so I don't have any other option but to get either a dog and throw at you or get a gun.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and yeah, nobody wants to get into that situation, but you're hearing more and more and seeing more and more of these cases come down where home invasions, just walk.
Well, was it in your area where the police came out with an advisory? If somebody breaks your home, just give them whatever they want.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Just let them go. Then they
you
probably
got
won't
to be
again.
kidding me. Law enforcement in my area would never give that advisory.
No, but it happened a lot, and we were having a rash of them, and some of them, were fatal. And it's just too bad. Here in my house, we prepare for that, right? But not everybody's done that. And to your point, I don't want to be the guy to have to exercise that because that's not something that you can just shove off. That you live with that forever. But at the same time, you have to be able to protect your family and with all the other things, kind of turning things back around to what we were talking about, with crime on the rise and more importantly, violent crime on the rise, these things might be coming knocking at your door. And so,
and I think, to bring it back, this bail reform movement is at the very heart of this rising crime. And I don't think people realize the reason why it is because in the criminal justice arena, if you are not present, if you fail to show up, your case has to be put on hold because you have all these constitutional rights and you have a right to confront your accusers. And so there's only very few limited situations where they can go ahead and try you in absentia. And so if you fail to show up, your case has to be put on hold, whether it takes you a couple of hours, a couple of days, weeks, months, or you never come back and they finally just dismiss your case. And so the type of release that's used, the private bail industry has less than a 10% failure to appear rate. Simple release has 50 to 80% failure to appear rate. It's not an alternative. And so you can see what impact that has on this little conveyor belt of the criminal justice system as the same number of cases are getting put on the conveyor belt, but you got a whole bunch of cases are getting put on hold every week for these simple release mechanisms that have such a high failure to appear rate. And that's why I say these simple release mechanisms create chaos. Chaos creates de facto decriminalization because the only way you can prevent the criminal justice system from collapsing is to dismiss cases.
yeah.
And then dismissing cases is seen as a green light to commit more crime. And that's what you're seeing in our urban areas. I mean, Texas has not, except for Harris County, because Texas has done the opposite direction. It has strengthened the criminal justice system, and they've limited the use of simple release, and they've inserted accountability. They want bail set based upon your criminal history, not based upon the charge that you're accused of.
Right, right. And you made such a good point earlier that I want to circle back on. With the bail reform stuff, the reason why, and I believe the reason why that our current process works and it has such a low failure to appear rate is because the system isn't holding you accountable anymore. It's somebody on the outside that's related to you that's holding you
Mm-hmm.
accountable. It is your family, it's your friend, and their name's tied to it. And so if you just blow off going to court, well, then who cares? But if you blow off going to court and then your friend loses their car, that's a problem.
Yeah. I think that is so important. And I mean, when I did my debate with this law firm, I made this argument. They're like, well, we can do that too. And I'm like, then why haven't you? I mean, the problem is, the federal government can't do individual assessments very well on, when people go to jail or prison. They do across the board stuff. And that's really what we're seeing when they say, if you're charged with this is what's going to happen. I mean, we don't look at criminal histories because then it requires an individual assessment. That's the reason why judges are so good at it. And that's the reason why we're seeing these bail reform movements tying the judge's hands, saying, if you're charged with this, you're going to be released. And I think what we're losing is we're losing families having the opportunity to pull problem child Jimmy back to the right path.
Yeah.
And look at AA, Alcoholics Anonymous. It works well. It's bipartisan. It has the support of everybody because it works. It has a belief in a supreme being. It doesn't tell you which supreme being, but it has these core concepts that a lot of people wouldn't support, but because it is so successful, everybody supports it. That should be our private bail system. That's how successful it is. But politics has made it so uncomfortable. You have these groups that are billionaires. And so if you want their money, you have to oppose it. And I think that's really where we are.
What do you think the goal of these politicians or the elite is to have a deconstruction of the criminal justice system?
Well, I think first and foremost, I think they've drunk the Kool-Aid. And so they think that, the things that they're selling work, even though they don't. So, let me kind of give you an example of this coalition. You have first the group that provides money to you to get elected. And like in Harris County, the guy running for DA against the sitting DA won. They gave him like $2 or $3 million in the primary last March.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so he gets elected. He's going to take office because he won by 1 point because the Republicans didn't spend any money on the race because they thought it was Harris County. You can't win a race there. If they'd have spent any money, they would have beat him. So he's going to take office January 1. So the second group from this coalition will invite him to some seminars. And at the seminars, they'll say, hey, quid pro quo. We got you elected, so here's what we want you to do. You're no longer going to seek drug enhancements. You're no longer going to seek long sentences. So someone who's a drug dealer with 30 pounds of cocaine is going to get 2 weeks because he's just going to get charged with drug possession, not have the enhancements. And it goes on and on and on. And then they have a third group that will provide you with research. And the research will say bail reform is not causing crime to increase. I mean, we saw a report of that right before the election from one of these groups. And then the final group of this coalition will give you press releases to support the actions that you're going to take. So you're going to do press releases saying, I'm changing the way we do crime. And we're no longer going to prosecute these things. We're no longer going to do these things. And crime will not increase. And here's a study that supports that. And it's based on all lies. Yeah. Cooking the books.
It's interesting because you see this. I mean, you see it play out, and you know how these special interest groups get their hold on people. And I get the mechanism, or I get the idea. Hey, I want to stay in power. I want the money, right? That solves a lot of problems. But what's the overarching goal? To destabilize?
I think there's a whole bunch of explanations there, but I think probably the one that makes the most sense is they want to move money from the largest budget item for the county to their programs. You could make more conspiracy oriented arguments, like, some of these people make a lot of money from arbitrage. The more chaos there is, the more opportunities there are to make money in arbitrage. And so, I mean, I don't know if I would go there, but I do agree that it's a coalition, and some of the coalition are true believers thinking they're doing good to help people. Other members of the coalition, I don't believe, are as well-minded.
A little bit nefarious there, but
well, they have an agenda, and we won't ever know what the true agenda is because they're not going to tell us.
right.
But
God willing, they'll never get there.
well, but the number one lie is when they say that we have systemic racism in the criminal justice system, and we have a disproportionate numbers of certain races in the jail, and we have to allow more crime to address that. That's an absolute lie. We have had a whole bunch of studies addressing why we have a disproportionate number of certain races in jail. Minnesota did a study tracking all the way back to people reporting crimes. So the race of the person reporting it, the race of the person arrested, all the way through the criminal justice system. And by a 10-to-1 margin, that race had more crimes reported, which means they're having more crime in their area. But once they got into the criminal justice system, they were treated better than other races. They had better outcomes. And so to say that the criminal justice system suffers from a systemic racism issue, that's just a recipe for making certain races mad. And it's been used in the past to get them to come out in greater numbers to vote, to support one party over the other. I think we're now at the point where that doesn't work anymore. This is like the second election where they haven't had some big scandal 4 months before an election, and then said, oh, you're not being treated fairly and you need to come out and vote. And so I would say this is the second election that didn't work. And it's showing that without that, the results are devastating to that party.
Yeah. I mean, it really has very little to do. Race really has very little to do with any of this.
Well, if you're in the inner cities, the race of the person arrested is usually the race of the person in the courtroom that's prosecuting, the judge and the bailiff and probably the defense attorney. How can you say the system's racist when everybody in the system in the urban areas are the same race?
Yeah, it's always interesting and really what it falls down to is a lack of accountability.
Yes, I agree with you completely. It's that argument is made to say we can't hold you accountable, and we're sorry for the way your race has been treated in the past, and so we have to give up public safety, and that's absolutely not true. Even that race wants public safety. I mean, that's the reason why men, by record numbers in that race, voted for Trump.
Yeah, there we go. So what can the average person do to help mitigate some of these bail reform messages or help with the cause of reducing crime? I mean, what's
in our urban cities, if there's a petition to recall your DA, you have one of those progressive DAs, you want to sign it. And you want to be careful in the way you sign it, because Gascon would have been removed at least 1 or 2 years earlier by a recall petition, but they disqualified signatures in such a large margin that they said there wasn't enough valid signatures. I think it was all political. They were trying to protect him, and, it worked out great. He lost by 20-something points after spending so much money on the race. So I think that's one thing you can do. And then I would say, if you're having a problem with crime, in the next election, vote crime. I mean, don't vote identity politics, vote crime until your parties. And I think the next election is going to be very interesting, especially on the national level, because the Obama coalition has been preventing the Democrat Party from putting up progressive, far left leaning candidates. Well, that coalition's gone. And so you're going to see the very first fight on the Democrat side, where by today's standards, a very far left progressive candidate would be put up as the presidential nominee. Whereas if they were to nominate the Pennsylvania governor, he would be a moderate. He would be acceptable to the right on a lot of issues. He can't get elected in the primary. And so it's going to be interesting. I mean, we always hear about the civil war on the right. The civil war that we're having right now on the left will get worse before it gets better. You could argue that Kamala Harris did not get a single vote before the primary, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, because she was perceived as a moderate. And so she went so far left during the primaries because she felt like she had to do that to get votes, but they didn't see it as sincere. And now you're going to hear the opposite. You're going to hear that she changed all of her positions, and so she was not progressive enough, and that's the reason why they lost. And so they needed a true progressive candidate, and that's what they need in the next election. In the meantime, Trump is going to take office. If he had been just reelected 2 years ago, he would have had a Democrat Senate, a Democrat House. He probably would have been impeached one more time. He would have been frustrated. He probably would have been so upset. He probably wouldn't have got anything done. Now he's going back into office with a Republican Republican House and Senate. He's probably the smartest man you know. He knows what to do. He's learned from his first 2 years in office. He's learned what mistakes he made, and he's come in loaded for bear. And there's a reason why the left needs to be worried about him, because he's smart and he knows what he's doing, and he's coming to shake things up. And they're reacting like they're scared to death. That's what he's going to do, because that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, it is really going to show what he's all about, right? Because like you mentioned before, if he would have won in the last election, there was a lot of checks and balances that would have kept him from doing all of the things.
Well, my favorite meme from that right after the election was suddenly the Democrats agree that he won 2 years ago, or 4 years ago, and so now he's ineligible to take office for a third term.
That's right. I saw that.
Yeah, so that's great, but it's going to be interesting to see, because there's a lot of people who disagree with me, but I think Trump is well-intentioned. He's got a terrible mouth, but I think he's well-intentioned. He wants to do what's best for the country, in his opinion. And I think his policies, that's what have been good for the country. The other things, how he tweaks the left and how he likes to just roll his dice and see what'll explode when he goes to meet with the Republican caucus in the House and says, well, that's my last election unless y'all do something. I mean, he's doing there just to tweak people. That's part of his sense of humor. And it's going to be crazy, because I've always said they're not going to allow him to take office.
Yeah. He's not in there yet.
He's not in there yet. It'll be interesting to see. But I think it's going to be a crazy time, because if you think about it, most people's second term is all foreign policy.
Yeah.
They've done everything they can domestically, but Trump, he is just a different creature. He is only the second person in the history of the United States to be elected to a second term that's non-consecutive. Grover Cleveland was the first. Grover Cleveland left office with some of the lowest rating by the public. So we'll see what Trump does, whether he goes the same way as Grover Cleveland. I don't think so. But think about it. Is there any other politician in the United States that could have withstood what Trump withstood?
No.
Is there anyone that had the financial ability to withstand it other than Trump? And then think he won, and they want to debate about the margin of victory. What would have happened if Biden hadn't dropped out? What would have happened if we didn't have all this lawfare? What would have happened if just you change just a couple of things? I mean, there's an internal poll from Biden that said at the time he dropped out, Trump was on track to win 400 electoral votes. So by that calculus, they saved 88 electoral votes by changing to Harris. And, that probably kept the House close and prevented a complete tsunami. I mean, if Biden hadn't dropped out, it would have been probably record numbers in the Senate and in the House. And so that was prevented. But, they couldn't keep Trump from winning. I don't think any other politician in the United States or in my lifetime would have been able to withstand that.
Yeah. And I think just to tie everything up in a super neat bow, he is a tough on crime politician. And I think a lot of the progressive movement, and for nothing else, the message that the voters were able to send of, hey, look, we're done with this. We need to have our
Yeah.
public safety back.
Well, let me give you one example of that. Before Trump started talking about the cartels taking over hotels or apartment complexes, I saw an article that was talking about cartels taking over the marijuana trade in California and that the legal market had kind of collapsed. So I just posted that to my Facebook page. It was immediately deleted by Facebook.
Hmm.
And so I thought, well, this has got to be an error. So I immediately posted again, immediately deleted. And I was like, wow, why are they editing this? And I'm like, it's got the word cartel in it.
Hmm.
And so I hadn't heard anything about cartel. And I thought, well, maybe this article is a conspiracy theory. Well, then Trump starts talking about cartels taking over apartment complexes. And then you hear the press say, well, it's only a couple of apartment complexes. And he's like, are you living in the United States of America where we've never thought it was okay, even if it was a couple? And now we're learning it's a lot more than that.
Yeah.
It seems like after the election, all these things that were being edited out of our narrative or the public's view are suddenly coming into view. And I don't have any faith that one party that got defeated would address these issues. But I do have faith that Trump will try, and there may be some people pushing back. But my favorite thing from the last couple of days is his guy that's for the czar for immigration, border czar. He's like, the Denver mayor and him agree on one thing, and he says the Denver mayor is willing to go to jail, and I'm willing to put him in jail. I was like, oh my God.
Yeah. Yeah. There you go. I love it. Well, thank you so much for doing this, man. It's really enlightening to see how a lot of the things that people, I mean, the average person, what's bail reform? It doesn't really affect me. No,
Yeah.
it really does. It runs deep, and having your explanation on how those mechanisms work was absolutely enjoyable, but also critical. So thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you for having me. And, we have our own podcast. So if people want to know more about criminal justice issues, they can just go to our website, pbtx.com. We have a blog where we highlight criminal justice issues, but we also have our own podcast that's linked in the menu, or you can just go to the Bail Post, thebailpost.com. And that's all we talk about is criminal justice issues.
That's awesome. And I'll get that information from you to put in the show notes on our podcast here. But thank you so much again. And I'm sure we'll hear more from you. So thanks.
Thank you very much.